It's the 1st of December 1969, and in a dimly lit room, an anxious young man and his family sit quietly around a television. On the grainy TV, a stern-faced government official, Colonel Alexander S. McKay, reaches into a large glass drum that's filled with blue capsules, each one containing a day of the year. The only noise that can be heard is the low hum of the television. And then...
September 14th.
September 14th. A deafening silence fills the room, but is eventually broken by an outburst of tears from the young man's mother. With a lottery number drawn so early, his chances of being called up for service are almost certain. This young man will be sent to fight in the Vietnam War. Most of us are at least somewhat familiar with the Vietnam War, but how did it begin? It can largely be traced back to French colonisation of the region, then known as French Indochina, which occurred in stages between 1858 and 1887. Resistance to French rule was pretty fierce, and it continued to rise right up until the outbreak of World War II. Early nationalist movements were fragmented and often suppressed, such as the Yen Bai Mutiny, but each failed uprising only strengthened calls for independence. By the early 20th century, opposition had become much more organised and much more ideological. Among the most influential figures to emerge was Ho Chi Minh, who combined anti-colonial nationalism with Marxist-Leninist thought. In 1930, he helped establish the Indochinese Communist Party, creating a more structured revolutionary movement. By the time World War II began, it was disciplined, it was mobilised, and it saw the outbreak of the war as a perfect opportunity to exploit. French authority in the region weakened dramatically once the war reached Southeast Asia. In 1940, after the fall of Paris, Imperial Japan moved into northern Vietnam and later occupied the rest of the territory. Administration of the region came under Vichy French control, at least in name, but real power rested with the Japanese military. The war placed enormous strain on the population. Rice requisitioning and mismanagement contributed to a devastating famine between 1944 and 1945, in which 1 to 2 million Vietnamese died. As you can imagine, resentment towards both French and Japanese authorities grew, strengthening nationalist movements that promised independence. In March 1945, Japan removed the remaining French administration entirely, and briefly encouraged the creation of a nominally independent Vietnamese state. But Japan's surrender only months later created a power vacuum. This was the moment Ho Chi Minh had been waiting for, and in August 1945, the Viet Minh launched what became known as the August Revolution, seizing key cities across the country. On September 2, 1945 in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. For the first time in nearly a century, Vietnam was no longer under formal colonial rule. Unfortunately, Vietnam's declaration of independence did not go uncontested. France was determined to reassert control over its former colony, and returned with military force in late 1945. Negotiations between French officials and Ho Chi Minh quickly deteriorated, and by 1946, full-scale conflict had broken out between French forces and the Viet Minh. The war that followed was long and brutal. The French controlled major cities and relied on conventional military superiority. The Viet Minh adopted guerrilla tactics, blending into rural populations and gradually expanding their influence across the countryside. As the Cold War intensified, the global significance of this war increased. The United States, concerned about communist expansion in Asia, began providing financial and military support to France, and after 1949, the newly established People's Republic of China provided backing to the Viet Minh. The war had become a proxy war between communist and capitalist powers. A turning point in the war came in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where French forces entrenched in a remote valley in northwest Vietnam were encircled and defeated in a prolonged siege. This loss shattered French political will to continue the war. Later that year, the Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The north would be governed by Ho Chi Minh's so-called Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The south would remain under a separate administration, which was run from Saigon. National elections were scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country, but those elections would never take place. By By the mid-1950s, American policymakers viewed Vietnam as a front line in the Cold War. According to domino theory, communist expansion had to be stopped wherever it appeared. This theory suggested that if Vietnam fell to communism, neighbouring countries in Southeast Asia would quickly follow suit. Therefore, the United States began providing financial aid, military equipment, and advisory personnel to support South Vietnam. Unfortunately, this regime became increasingly authoritarian, suppressing opposition groups and alienating segments of the rural population. American involvement gradually deepened over time. Military advisors were deployed to train South Vietnamese forces, but the number of these advisors being deployed was constantly increasing. In 1964, the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, after which Congress authorized the president to use military force in Vietnam. America had now formally entered the war. By the late 1960s, hundreds of thousands of American troops were stationed in Vietnam. Massive bombing campaigns targeted North Vietnamese infrastructure, while ground forces engaged in search and destroy missions across the south. The war is infamous for its brutality, and war crimes were committed by both sides, including massacres of civilians, bombings of civilian infrastructure, torture, and murder of prisoners of war. 58,220 American soldiers were killed, over 300,000 were wounded, about half of which required hospitalisation, and at least 21,000 were permanently disabled. The average age of those who died was about 23. Studies in the 1980s estimated that about 15% suffered post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Later studies put this number at about 30%. A popular narrative is that this is largely due to the guerrilla tactics used by the Viet Cong, such as extensive use of booby traps and hit-and-run tactics. I want to clarify that by focusing on the casualties of and the effect on US soldiers, I'm not trying to undermine the effect on the Vietnamese. It's just that this video specifically is about the effect on US servicemen. So, what was the effect on US servicemen? Measuring the effect of war on soldiers is something that has been of interest to researchers since at least the 1950s, although most early studies focused on the potential benefits, such as educational attainment through things like the GI Bill. Later, research began to wonder about the potential scarring caused by military service. But measuring the effect of military service isn't straightforward. A common and perhaps the most straightforward way economists measure the effect of something is by using what's called ordinary least squares, or OLS. Here, we can say that some outcome, for example lifetime earnings, is equal to some variable of interest, such as years of military service, plus some other control variables like education or race, as well as some other stuff that we can't observe. The relationship doesn't start at zero either, so we also add a constant or an intercept. Finally, these variables don't have a one-to-one relationship with lifetime earnings, so by using OLS, we measure so-called coefficients and add them to the function. These coefficients tell us how responsive lifetime earnings are to a change in one of our variables, such as years of military service. If the coefficient is minus 0.5, it means that, on average, one additional year of military service reduces lifetime earnings by 0.5, holding all other variables constant. When I say holding all other variables constant, I mean that we are essentially comparing two people whose other observed traits like education and race are the same. They only differ in years of military service. If the coefficient increases, this means that the effect is larger. But in order for OLS to be accurate, there are a bunch of assumptions that must be met. One such assumption is that these variables we measure are uncorrelated with our error term, or our unobservables. In other words, OLS only works if people who serve in the military aren't systematically different in unmeasured ways from those who don't serve. In the case of our regression, there are plenty of unobservables that might be correlated with military service. Things like how much of a risk taker they are, whether their parents were in the military, or cognitive ability. The issue is that these traits might also affect lifetime earnings or other outcomes that we're interested in. This is a problem, because as the number of years of military service change, these unobservables change too. But because we don't observe them, the model doesn't know by how much they're changing, or even what they are. Therefore, the coefficient for military service might look much bigger or smaller than it actually is, because it's absorbing the effect of these unobservables. For instance, if in reality, the coefficient on whether or not a parent was in the military is 10, the coefficient for years of military service might absorb some or all of this. So what we need is something that changes who serves in the military, but is unrelated to earnings potential. This is called a natural experiment. We can then use other tools alongside these natural experiments to answer the questions that we can't with regular OLS. One such tool is called instrumental variable methods, or IV. Here, we need some variable that affects our lifetime earnings through military service, but is uncorrelated with our unobserved variables. In the case of the Vietnam War, the draft appeared to do just that, seeing as the draft lottery numbers were randomly assigned to birth dates. Because those lottery numbers determined who was called up first, they strongly predicted military service, while remaining unrelated to background characteristics. As casualties mounted and the draft expanded, the war increasingly shaped domestic politics in the United States, and set the stage for the lottery that would determine who would be sent to fight. The draft system was operated through a nationwide bureaucracy known as selective service. Originally, under this system, every draft-eligible man was assigned to a local draft board, usually made up of older men from his own community. These boards decided whether he was available for service, deferred, or exempt, and crucially, when he would be called up. In theory, this system benefited from flexibility, but in reality, it created some pretty serious problems. Decisions varied widely from board to board, with similar men being treated very differently depending on where they lived, and predictably, the system was widely criticised as arbitrary, opaque, and vulnerable to social and class bias. On the 1st of December 1969, the draft lottery was introduced as an attempt to fix this. Under this new system, induction was determined at the national level rather than by these local boards. Each day of the year was assigned a number based on the order in which it was drawn. This was done by placing 366 capsules, each containing a different date of the year, into a large container. The capsules were drawn one at a time, and the dates were recorded in sequence. If your date of birth was drawn first, you received lottery number 1. If it was drawn second, you received lottery number 2, and so on. That number determined how likely you were to be drafted. Men turning 19 in a given year were ranked according to that number. Those with lower numbers were called first, and once the military's manpower requirement was met, the remaining numbers were not called upon. An economist called Joshua Angrist realised that the randomness of the draft lottery could act as a natural experiment, and could be used for an instrumental variable analysis to determine the effect of military service in the Vietnam War on outcomes such as lifetime earnings. Unlike ordinary least squares or OLS, instrumental variable estimation uses what's known as two-stage least squares, or 2SLS. As the name suggests, this has two stages. Luckily, both stages look very similar to our OLS equation from before. In the first equation, military service is determined by one's draft lottery number, along with a bunch of other control variables. This first stage gives us a predicted probability of military service, which we call D-hat. A key idea, which unfortunately I can't explain in more detail in this video, but is explained in more detail in the video I've linked below, is that D-hat is constructed only from the lottery number, not from things like risk tolerance, family background, or ability. So if the lottery is random and only influences outcomes through military service, D-hat should no longer be tangled up with the unobservables that distorted our OLS model. Using this method, Angrist's famous 1990 paper found that white Vietnam era veterans earned substantially less than comparable non-veterans in the late 1970s and early 1980s, roughly 15% less. The interpretation wasn't necessarily that the war permanently reduced productivity, but that time spent in the military meant that that time was not spent accumulating civilian work experience, and that lack of experience translated into measurable income losses. 2 decades later, Angrist, along with co-authors Stacy Chen and Jay Song, returned to this research question by following the veterans into their middle ages. Their later work showed earning losses of about 16% in the 1970s and around 10% in the 1980s, but by the 1990s, the estimated penalty had fallen close to zero and was statistically insignificant. At least part of the explanation for this seems to lie in the education of veterans. In a 2011 paper, Angrist and Chen showed that Vietnam-era service increased schooling by roughly 0.3 years on average. College attendance rose by about 5 to 9 percentage points among affected cohorts. The estimated return to this additional schooling was around 7% per year of education, which was enough to offset much of the earlier experience-related earnings loss. But even though annual earnings may have caught up, the income lost in the first decade was never repaid. Health outcomes also appeared much more muted than you might expect. While veterans were more likely in simple comparisons to report poor health, draft-based IV estimates showed little statistically significant effect on overall self-reported health, physical limitations, or disability status. There was evidence of higher smoking rates and increased alcohol use among veterans, but no clear increase in long-term disability application rates attributable to service. However, being drafted did seem to affect how likely veterans were to commit certain crimes. The following paper found that military service increased the probability of incarceration for violent crime by roughly 0.3 percentage points, while reducing incarceration for non-violent crime by a similar magnitude. The overall incarceration rate barely moved, but the composition shifted towards violent offences. These changes might be small in absolute terms, but they are statistically significant, meaning it's very unlikely that the researchers found an effect that doesn't exist in reality. Military service also affected political beliefs, at least temporarily. Men with low lottery numbers were significantly more likely to adopt anti-war attitudes and shift toward democratic identification in the 1970s. However, research using voter records decades later found effects on turnout, party registration, and ideological identification that were close to zero and statistically insignificant. Those early political effects measured in the 1970s didn't appear to persist into later adulthood. More recently, researchers examined the effect on the next generation. They found that children of draft-eligible fathers were several percentage points more likely to report marijuana use and delinquent behaviour, and more likely to initiate substance use at an earlier age. They also found that children of draft-eligible fathers were more likely to experience lower levels of paternal involvement. So while the effect on earnings and political beliefs of veterans largely converged over time, some consequences appear to have been passed down to the children of those who were drafted. As you can see, on this channel I discuss economics research that uses data and econometrics techniques such as IV to better understand the world. If you've made it this far, you should consider subscribing so you don't miss future videos like this. An important caveat to the results mentioned above is that these estimates do not measure what the effect of military service would have been on anyone had they fought in the war. Instead, they measure the effect on a specific group known in economics as compliers. These are individuals whose decision to serve was caused by draft eligibility. This was referred to as the local average treatment effect, or LATE. For many government policies, we can split those potentially affected into 4 groups: compliers, always takers, never takers, and defiers. Compliers are those whose behaviour moves in the direction encouraged by the policy. In our case, they join the army when they're drafted, and they do not join the army when they're not drafted. Always takers are those who joined the army regardless of the policy. Never takers are those who did not join the army regardless of their draft number. Defiers are those who do the opposite of what the policy suggests they should do. They join the army when their lottery number is high, and they refuse to join when their lottery number is low. This distinction is particularly relevant in the case of the Vietnam War, where draft resistance was widespread. Many people found ways to avoid military service, either through legal channels or outright defiance, which limits how broadly the previously mentioned findings can be applied. One of the most well-known draft resistors was Muhammad Ali, who refused induction in 1967 on religious grounds. He famously stated, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." As a result, he was stripped of his heavyweight title, convicted of draft evasion, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Although he never served the sentence, the conviction remained until it was overturned by the Supreme Court in 1971. Bill Clinton received multiple student deferments while studying at Georgetown and Oxford. Donald Trump received 5 deferments. 4 were granted for his college education, and the 5th was based on a medical claim involving bone spurs. Beyond high-profile individuals, many others avoided the draft by leaving the country. It is estimated that between 60,000 and 100,000 men fled the United States, with the majority seeking refuge in Canada or Sweden. This wave of resistance became one of the defining features of the Vietnam draft era. The results we mentioned earlier only apply to those whose behaviour was shaped by the draft lottery, not to those who had the means, status, or personal conviction to avoid service altogether. Therefore, military service may not have had the same effect on Muhammad Ali, Bill Clinton, or Donald Trump. Just like OLS, two-stage least squares has some pretty restrictive assumptions that determine whether the estimated effects are accurate. The first of these assumptions is relevance. Is the instrument, in this case the draft lottery number, correlated with the treatment variable, military service? I think it's safe to say that it is. Those with lottery numbers below the cutoff were about 15% more likely to serve. Second is the exclusion restriction. This states that one's draft lottery number should only affect the outcome, such as lifetime earnings or criminal activity, through military service. Even though the draft lottery was randomly assigned, randomness alone doesn't guarantee this assumption holds. We still need to ask whether draft eligibility could have changed behaviour in other ways. Some argue that it could have. For instance, men with low lottery numbers, in other words those at high risk of being drafted, may have chosen to obtain additional years of education in order to qualify for student deferments. If draft eligibility pushed some men into more schooling, and schooling affects earnings, then their lottery number could influence earnings through education as well as through military service. In that case, the exclusion restriction would be violated, and the effect of military service would be distorted. A third assumption is exchangeability, sometimes called independence. This requires that the instrument, draft lottery number, is not correlated with unobserved characteristics that affect the outcome. This means that the lottery number must be unrelated to the error term in the earnings equation. Here, the random assignment of lottery numbers is doing important work. Because the lottery was intended to be random, low numbers were not supposed to be systematically given to men from poorer families, lower ability backgrounds, or different regions. However, the first draft lottery in 1969 had a procedural flaw. The capsules containing birth dates weren't mixed properly, which meant that men born earlier in the year were more likely to receive lower lottery numbers. Does this violate our assumptions? Potentially. If month of birth is correlated with other characteristics like school starting age, educational attainment, or maturity, then one's lottery number may no longer be statistically independent of factors that affect later earnings. That would create correlation between the instrument and the error term. Finally, we have the monotonicity assumption. This means that lottery numbers should only affect military service in one direction. In other words, lower lottery numbers should only ever increase the likelihood of military service. However, do you remember earlier we mentioned defiers? Those who do the opposite of what the policy tells them to do. They would have joined the army if they got a high lottery number, and dodged the draft if they got a low lottery number. Honestly, I don't know if people like this existed, but if they did, it means that the monotonicity assumption would have been violated, further biasing the results from earlier. So relevance seems plausible, exchangeability is largely supported by the randomness of the lottery, though not perfectly. The exclusion restriction is more debatable, especially if draft eligibility changed behaviour in ways unrelated to actual service, and monotonicity depends on there being a meaningful group of defiers. So before we move on, I'm curious, what do you think? Do these assumptions seem reasonable in this context, or do you think that the results we discussed earlier are biased? Assuming they are not, let's return to our young man from the start of the video. With a lottery number of 1, this young man was almost certainly draft eligible, and unless he was medically disqualified, his induction was highly likely. Of the roughly 2.7 million Americans who served in Vietnam, 58,220 were killed, or about 2%. Around 150,000 were wounded requiring hospitalisation, around 5 to 6%. As mentioned earlier, estimates suggest that about 15 to 30% of veterans later experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. If he avoided the worst of these outcomes, he still lost years of his early adulthood fighting a grueling war far from home. Even if he came home mentally and physically unscathed, the effects of the war lingered for decades. In the 1970s, he earned roughly 15% less than comparable men who had not served. In the 1980s, that gap narrowed to around 10%. It wasn't until the 1990s that the difference largely disappeared. Part of the reason that it did eventually disappear was the GI Bill. Because of his service, he was entitled to educational benefits including tuition support and living stipends for college or vocational training, which he availed of. The war also, at least temporarily, shaped how he saw the world politically. In his youth, he was more anti-war and a stronger supporter of the Democratic Party. Later in his life, he had children, but he was a more distant father than those who were not drafted, and his kids were more likely to engage in risky behaviour, including marijuana use and other forms of delinquency. Had his birth date not been drawn so early on the 1st of December 1969, his life would have almost certainly looked a lot different. Luckily for researchers, econometrics, specifically IV estimation, gives us a clearer picture of what that difference was. I'd like to give a massive thank you to Joshua Angrist, who revised the script and gave really helpful feedback. If you want to know more about the IV methodology, I've pinned a comment below with a link to a video where he explains IV in more detail. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, you might also enjoy this video about what really ended the slave trade, or this video that discusses what the Dutch East India Company can teach us about the new space race. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time on Econ Unpacked.